Hello, everyone, and welcome to tonight's event with Brookline Booksmith, featuring Emily St. John Mandel in conversation with Isaac Fitzgerald, discussing The Glass Hotel, now in paperback. My name is Alex. I'm the events director at Brookline Booksmith in Brookline, Massachusetts. If you're familiar with our store, it's really lovely to have you back. Great to have you. We appreciate your support. And if you have never heard of us before and are somehow here anyway, thank you so much for being here. We're really happy to have you enter into our community today, and we appreciate your support for Emily and for an independent bookstore through your purchases and your attendance. As I said, the chat and question boxes are open, so feel free to make use of those. Remember to set your chat to all panelists and attendees so you can talk to other attendees, and please drop any and all Q&A questions into the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom window so they're not lost in the chat. Please note that Brookline Booksmith has a strict policy against abusive behavior and language, and at our discretion, any attendee can be removed from an event for partaking in such behavior. I'd like to begin by thanking Isaac Fitzgerald for acting as our moderator this evening. Formerly of the Rumpus McSweeney's BuzzFeed books, Isaac appears frequently on the Today Show and is the author of the national best-selling children's book, How to Be a Pirate, as well as the co-author of Pen and Ink, Tattoos and the Stories Behind Them, and Knives and Ink, Chefs and the Stories Behind Their Tattoos, with recipes. Thank you so much, Isaac, for leading our talk this evening. I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I am genuinely and entirely thrilled to introduce tonight's guest author. Emily St. John Mandel's 5 novels include The Glass Hotel and Station 11, which was a finalist for the National Book Award and the PEN/Faulkner Award, and has been translated into 32 languages. She lives in New York City with her husband and daughter. There are a lot of words that pop up over and over again in professional book reviewing and author blurbs. And when I see these words, as a bookseller, I try very hard to force my own language in describing books away from the descriptors that I've seen too many times. Once in a while, though, there's an author who will very firmly cement themselves as the one author that I cannot describe without a specific well-loved word. They own it unshakably. And Emily's books are the only books that I can't help but describe as haunting. And it isn't just that her books are intimately concerned with walking back and forth from life to death, as if from room to room. It isn't just the delicacy of prose alone. It's certainly not because her writing is grim, because no matter how harrowing the subject matter of her work, something kindles in the heart of her books that is not grim. I like to say that Station 11 is the only post-apocalyptic novel that I've read and reread that leaves me feeling warm inside. The tremendous thing about Emily's books is that they are so quiet and so intentional and so methodical and unhurried, but what they lay down gently for the reader can't be scraped up again. Characters, moments, images, and an almost indescribable sense of living place echo for months or years after you've read one of her novels. It's not necessarily a terrible thing to be haunted, and when Emily's books haunt, it's wonderful. The Glass Hotel is a good book. From ocean liner to New York high-rise to an unlikely hotel reflected in water, it's somehow both sympathetic and distant, wide-flung and meticulously personal. It's a beautiful book. I've read it only once, and that was a year ago, and it swims into my head at least once a week, asking that we look at one another. I couldn't be happier than to have Emily join the Booksmith tonight, and to have you all here as well. It is a pleasure to welcome Emily St. John Mandel and Isaac Fitzgerald.
All right, I'm just going to do it.
That was, wow. Thank you so much, Alex. That was the nicest intro ever. And Isaac, thank you for doing this again. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure, Emily. Thank you so much for asking me. And seriously, I just wanted to clap that up because one, that was beautiful. That sentiment was fantastic, and I 100%
really
agree.
Nice.
And two, I just feel like everybody at home, you can clap a little bit whenever you feel the need. Just if you're in a place where you can be noisy, sometimes these can be a little quiet, and I want to encourage that. So we feel a little bit of togetherness. Emily and I did an event for the Glass Hotel on March 24th, I believe. Would that be correct?
That was the publication date. That was, I think, both of our first Zoom events. And now we're like weathered, grizzled Zoom veterans. We've been doing this for a year.
We've got like the ring lights, and we've got
exactly. Yeah.
So don't get me wrong, we are going to dive into the Glass Hotel.
Yeah.
It was funny, I actually went looking for my old questions from that event to make sure we're not overlapping too much. But I did want to start to just acknowledge that a year has passed.
Yeah.
And kind of ask you a little bit about your year. I know you are spending time with your husband and your daughter.
Mm-hmm.
Just asking, how has that been going? I will say this, you have the exact same Zoom setup as you did on March 24th. But so kind of how have you been making sense of what's been happening in the world?
That's a great question. it feels like such an understatement and like so, obvious to say it's been intense because, who hasn't had an intense year? Yeah, homeschooling's no joke, but my kid's young, which is helpful. So there's been a lot of like trying to engage her in the idea that, letters make sounds without being obnoxious about it. So that takes a lot of my energy. I've been keeping really, really busy because for me, this sort of the underlying problem of the past year has been that I can't see my family. They're in Western Canada and I haven't seen them in 15 months. So that's like the thing that I've been dealing with. So I've been trying to stay as busy as possible. And I have to say, the work has been a pleasure this year. I've been writing fiction. I recently finished a new book that I'm really excited about. I've been working on a TV project, which has been fun. And I just started writing a movie with a friend of mine who's also my collaborator for the TV project. So, work can be a pleasure and a coping mechanism, frankly, at a time like this. Day to day, I feel incredibly fortunate. We haven't gotten sick. I know a ton of people who've gotten sick, but nobody I love has died. We've been able to form a pod with 2 families and a shared nanny. And that's how I'm able to work and how my daughter gets a little bit of, socialization. She's 5. Yeah, it's been a year. How about you? Can I ask you the same question?
It has absolutely been a year. And yeah, you 100% can. For me, I fell into this habit of walking a lot.
I've been seeing your pictures. Are you walking to Manhattan?
Yeah, I'm walking about 20,000 steps a day.
That's
which
awesome.
Again, I feel just like yourself. I know a lot of people, but I've been very fortunate in that my family has done pretty well during this, and I feel lucky to have time to do something like this, because unlike yourself, I'm not a parent,
right?
And so I'm in a safe and stable living situation, which is wonderful, and it allows me to spend time basically going out for these super long walks. And let's be honest, in a year or two, I'm sure I'm going to look back at this moment and realize like, oh, that was a really wild thing you were doing to cope with this, because like you said, I live in Brooklyn and I've been walking a lot, all the way to Central Park, all the way to Manhattan. But this is what we do, right? This is how we try to make sense of the world. And for me, it's really, even during the winter months, it's been about going outside. But it's a good place to jump off, because this is something I've been thinking about while I was thinking about The Glass Hotel, and of course Station 11 as well, is how both of these books, in very different ways, but they both have a crises at the heart of them. Very different types of crises, but crises that affect a lot of people. And so I was wondering, what is it about a crisis? Why did you want to make that the heart of these 2 books?
Believe it or not, I didn't do it on purpose. New York Magazine called me the disaster artist. I was like, oh, really? But then, once the initial horror wore off, I saw their point. So with Station 11, there's this devastating flu pandemic and the world ends, and we pick up 20 years later. With that book, I wasn't really interested in writing about disaster per se. I was interested in writing about a post-technological world. But of course, technology's got to end somehow. So, in getting from point A to point B, like there had to be a disaster in there. So that was why that happened.
The pandemic was almost a tool to get.
Yeah, exactly. And then The Glass Hotel, every character in this book is completely fictional, but the central crime was inspired by Bernie Madoff's Ponzi scheme, which of course collapsed back in 2008. So it was originally going to be a sort of tightly focused white-collar crime novel, just about the build-up and implosion and aftermath of this massive Ponzi scheme. But yeah, to your point, I mean, that is a crisis. I don't think I did it on purpose. At the same time, I think that if you're writing fiction, it sure helps to place your characters in a position of disaster. That just like gets the plot going. It's a cliche to say you find out who people are in extremity, but you do, so that it's great for character development. But
stretch these characters that you've created to see what they're going to do.
Yeah, exactly. See how they react in these extreme circumstances.
And in The Glass Hotel, let's be honest, we've got sometimes amoral decisions.
We do. Yeah, you can't be a nice person who runs a Ponzi scheme. So there are immoral decisions. There's there's committing a crime, which of course, there is a character in the book who does that. But then there's also that kind of moral, I don't want to say, I was going to say moral gray area. That's not true though. It's morally pretty black and white, but kind of a gray area in terms of how bad a person you have to be to do it, which I think like a lot of the shadier elements of life fall into that. So the first part of the novel that I wrote was about the staffers. There's this, they form this kind of Greek chorus through the book. And, the way I thought of them was, would you have to be an entirely terrible person to find yourself gradually sliding towards something that you realized a little bit too late was actually a Ponzi scheme? You didn't quite understand the investment fund at first. Turned out you didn't understand it for a reason. If you're covering, say, your parents' mortgages and tuition and enormous checks are being thrown at you, and you've been able to convince yourself that somehow it'll all turn out okay. And in fact, your boss is convinced of that because it's turned out okay for 30 years or however long it's been. So yeah, it is amoral, but it's also somehow eerily not incomprehensible to me. I feel like you don't have to be this kind of like Disney villain mustache twirler, to find yourself in that situation.
Yeah, it could also very much be almost like a frog in boiling water.
Exactly. Yeah.
You mentioned that was the part of the book that you started with, and at one point this was going to be the entirety of the book. I do want to ask about how you got outside of that, but that'll be the second one. The first question I have is, what was it about? This is one of the things that you do so incredibly well in this book. You make a financial crisis seem interesting.
Oh, thank you. The key is to not write about finance very much.
I would say, especially in fiction, it's really impressive. And so what was it? What made you look at the Bernie Madoff's Ponzi scheme and say, you know what, I feel like I could find a story in there?
I was fascinated by the mass delusion of it, which, if you think of the scheme as having two sides, on the one hand, the perpetrators, so I just talked about this weird office staff going to work to make fake account statements. And then on the other side, the investors. And it seems to me that both sides have to be kind of convincing themselves of this false narrative, where on the office side, you'd have to convince yourself that what you were doing was somehow okay, if only just to sleep at night. You'd have to convince yourself that even if it was maybe a little unethical and shady, you were making a lot of money for a lot of people, whatever the story is. And then on the investor side, I actually know somebody who was who invested with Madoff, and he was one of the really lucky ones. He didn't lose that much money, and it wasn't catastrophic. He had retirement savings in a whole bunch of different places and just lost this one section. And what he says, and this is a very astute, very financially savvy person who actually prepares taxes as part of his living, is he said, we would go over those account statements. They never made sense. We could never understand where those numbers were coming from. But the returns were so good. So, and that kind of shrug, which, by the way, would have been everybody's experiences, including Steven Spielberg's financial advisors, who I'm going to go out on a limb and say those guys are probably pretty good at their job. But yeah, it was like everybody kind of decided en masse to believe in this fairy tale.
And that is what drew you in, is this idea of the excuses that we can kind of make for our own actions on both sides of that.
Exactly. Yeah. And it kind of dovetails with something else I find really interesting. Maybe because it relates to a lot of subjects that really interest me, like memory. But the condition of knowing and not knowing something at the same time. Like that's, I think that we all fall prey to that. An example I've been thinking about in this realm lately is, think of your most selfish friend. Like, there's something a little bit off with that person, but you can kind of choose not to know it because you do enjoy their company. So that kind of state of knowing and not knowing is really interesting to me, and really interesting to write about, in terms of, in terms of character development.
Yeah, and the ways we can kind of trick ourselves. Well, another thing that this book and Station 11 obviously have in common is there's a plethora of characters. They're all so incredibly three-dimensional. You do such incredible character work in your writing. But so when did you know that you wanted to expand outside of this crisis that is still very much the heart of the book, and how did you kind of discover those characters? Because we basically start, if memory is serving, in the 90s, right, or the early
Right.
2000s, and we have which again I feel like you wrote about beautifully. Like as
Thank
somebody
you.
that lived those times, as I was reading, I was like, oh,
You were at those clubs.
yeah, I was like,
Yeah.
I remember this. I remember. I think I said that during the launch event, I did say you wrote a book. I worked at a hotel. There's
Mhm.
a hotel in this book. There's boats. There's drugs.
Right.
So I felt like
You're like, check.
yeah,
check.
this book really spoke to me. But yeah, what made you decide to go outside of the financial story, and where did you find these characters that you kind of flushed out the book with?
It was hard. It took a long time to figure out. I don't write from an outline, and there are real positives and negatives of that. The negative is it can get a little crazy, and you have to reel yourself back in when you go off into a cul-de-sac that makes no sense. The positive is there is a real possibility of surprise, which can be kind of wonderful. So it was originally going to be focused so tightly around this crime. But then once the criminal was in prison, this guy, Jonathan Alcaides, if you haven't read the book, it's not much of a spoiler. He goes to prison. He starts to lose his grip on reality a little bit. And he starts to see what he believes are the ghosts of investors who died by suicide. And at first, it was just that. I just wanted to suggest a kind of mental unraveling. But I love ghost stories. I've always sought them out. I've been really into them since I was a kid. And I realized that I was really enjoying the ghost story element. So it just became more and more ghostly. I remember when I sent an early draft of this book to my agent a few years ago, like long before publication, one of the editorial questions I had was, are there too many ghosts? And she was like, no. So I kept them all in. There's like 7 of them or something. But then, once I'd brought in all of these elements into the plot, there's all the stuff with Vincent's past and her relationship with her brother Paul, and kind of stuff about art in there, and this kind of ghostliness. I realized it was a pretty complicated, kind of amorphous book. And so then when I'm in that situation, I find myself trying to think of commonalities, like what is a theme that might pull every section of this book together? And I thought, well, since I'm writing about money by default, by writing about this financial crime, how about if every section of the book concerns money in some way? And how about if every section concerns ghosts? Because it can be kind of interesting to think, what are the possibilities of what a ghost story is? It seems to me that when we use that phrase, ghost story, we tend to think of it in these kind of narrowly classical terms, the specter wafting down the corridor and the dilapidated Victorian mansion, like that kind of thing. But what if your life is haunted by the ghosts of the lives you didn't lead? That's another kind of haunting. Or who makes it even as far as early adulthood without accumulating, a litany of regrets, like things we wish we'd said or hadn't said or done or hadn't done at various points. And the way those moments haunt us, that's another kind of haunting. So yeah, it became interesting to use that idea of the ghost story, or that idea of hauntedness, as something to kind of hopefully pull the book together.
Yeah, and again, the I think that's not to be like boats, hotels, but also regret. Regret is big. It's a favorite theme of mine, and it's something that that you write about so well.
Thank you.
I just love what you just said though about ghost stories and kind of different ways of thinking about them. Was there anything that you've read? Like, when did you, as a writer, start to realize ghost stories could maybe be more than that? And not to knock a good old Victorian.
Yeah, I'm into them, to be clear.
Haunted. Yeah, no.
Yeah.
Love you. But when did you start to kind of realize ghost stories could be more?
That's a great question. There's a very strange chapter or a strange moment, I should say, toward the end of Station 11, that what's coming up in like every audience Q&A for like 5 years straight as I was traveling for that book. This weird moment where a character in one of the post-apocalyptic sections is recounting the time she and her friends went into this abandoned house. And they found a child's nursery and like a doll's tea set with no dust on it. And then they began to realize that maybe the child's rocking chair in a corner of the room was moving very slightly. And I got, it's like 2 paragraphs. It's this weird little set piece. I got so many questions about that. And I'd always have this like eloquent answer, like, well, it had to do with a blah, 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 blah. But the real reason was that I wanted to write a ghost story. It was kind of what I realized as I was giving all these answers about whatever it was that I was talking about at the time. And, the more I talked about that section and the more I answered that question, the more I realized that, I wasn't lying in my answers, but I really wanted to write a ghost story. Like, that was another really big reason. So, yeah, I think I'd been thinking about that since the last book. Thinking,
it had been coming out in these different ways. Another thing that blows my mind about what you just said was that you don't outline, because especially The Glass Hotel, we are talking about, it is intricate, this book, and you are moving up and down a timeline, and there are pieces that you don't figure out until the end. There's mystery, there's hauntings, but everything kind of clicks together. So without going from an outline,
right?
How do you clean up that? I don't want to make an assumption here, but at some point it's probably pretty messy.
Oh my God, my first drafts are a catastrophe. It's like, it's barely English, frankly. So if you write without an outline, you end up with these train wreck first drafts. Like, it is a mess. Nobody reads my first drafts. And in terms of just revision strategies, once I have a first draft, I will sometimes put together some kind of outline just to help myself in the revisions. But yeah, there's no roadmap starting out. For me, it typically takes me about a year or a year and a half to write a first draft of a 350-page novel or whatever The Glass Hotel was. And then like years longer of just revising over and over and over again. The way I think about it, this is maybe kind of a weird analogy, but I remember when I was a kid watching, it would have been the CBC on like presumably a very slow news day. They were interviewing this guy who carves ducks, and they were like really realistic and beautiful. And the interviewer said, "How do you carve these incredibly realistic ducks?" And the carver, who was kind of a man of few words, he said, "Well, I just take the block of wood and I carve away everything that isn't the duck." And that's kind of how I think of the writing process. It's like the first draft, it's just a block of wood. It's just raw material. And then over years and years and years of painstaking revision, I'm trying to find the duck. I'm trying to find the novel in there. So yeah, there's no real secret to it. I just revise it a million times.
And you keep peeling it back. That said, we've got the financial crisis, we've got the regret, we've got hauntings. There's also, like you mentioned, there's an art and music, towards the end of the book. What made you kind of want to tackle that aspect of, basically a different part of, one might argue, a bit of high society?
Right. I mean, in terms of like the video art and the composer and all that.
Mm-hmm.
I think we just inevitably write about what we're interested in. And, I personally find that often it's just my personal interests kind of adhering themselves to what I'm working on. With the video art, I'd been thinking about some art that a friend of mine was doing years ago. He was doing these cool kind of video portraits where it would be about 5 minutes of a person. It wasn't that dissimilar from Andy Warhol's screen tests, but he'd kind of move around a bit in an interesting way. And it was original. It was cool. And that was really the first time I'd thought about video being abstract. I'd always thought of it as being kind of like an outsider to video and all that. I'd always thought of it in like strictly narrative terms, like, a TV series, the 3 acts. But yeah, it was cool to see it made kind of abstract like that. So I was thinking about that kind of video art. And then just thinking about some music I'd seen a few years ago, I'd heard a few years ago that I really liked. This extremely obscure band where the bass player was the bartender at the Korean restaurant I used to go to all the time, one of those New York connections. And the music was kind of drifting and dreamlike and haunting and really beautiful. And I just liked the idea of pairing those two.
Yeah, and bringing them together. I also, as I was flipping through the book again to prepare for tonight, something I was thinking about. There's this great line, and you're going to have to forgive me because I'm not going to remember the character. Okay. But basically, so The Glass Hotel, for those who are not familiar with the book yet, absolutely buy the paperback. It's there's this hotel, and basically at one point one of the characters says, people come up here because they think they want to be in wilderness because it's this very far location, but actually what they want to do is kind of be safe in wilderness. And
yeah, they want to be wilderness adjacent.
Yeah, wilderness,
Yeah.
but also just this kind of frame and this view. And as I was re-experiencing the Glass Hotel, and again remembering all these intricate, beautiful ways that you made everything click together, there is also, it's a lot about how one looks and at the world and kind of sees the world, and it did feel like you were almost taking these snapshots of different sections. Is that something that you're pulling purposefully, like not to get back to the duck, but is that stuff that you are finding as you're writing, or you like just the music and the art that you were just talking about, or is that something you are sitting down, you're like, oh, this is something I've always meant to write about? Or are you discovering it as you're following your characters?
I think I'm discovering it as I'm following the characters. Although sometimes the setting will be a place I've always wanted to write about. Now, I'm from British Columbia, but nowhere nearly as remote as the village in the book. Yeah, the village in the book, it's based on a place where I stayed for about 2 weeks and I was 14. A friend of my mom's had a cottage up there, and we spent a couple of weeks there. Getting to this place, you would drive to the northernmost tip of Vancouver Island, which that whole island, it's like a 6-hour drive. It's really, really long. Northernmost tip, you'd keep going a little bit inland to an inlet. You would run out of roads and wait for a water taxi. The water taxi would take you to this place called Quatsino, which was a pier. It was a post office, which was about the size of like a standard New York City apartment bathroom. It was the tiniest little shack you ever saw sitting by the pier. I want to say there were about 3 school-age children in town, population 90 or something like that. The kids would go to school on the mail boat, which is what it sounds like. It's the boat that takes the mail out and then brings it back in the afternoon. So, just the extremity of that remoteness was amazing. I'd always kind of wanted to revisit it in fiction. It was extremely remote, extremely beautiful. So yeah, that was one place that I had always kind of wanted to write about. But I think that thing you're talking about, the snapshots, is more about thinking of the way my characters would see the world.
And thinking about the ways in which they would interact. Speaking about just the way in which art can reflect life, and like you said, you've been asked about Station 11 so much, and I do want to remind the audience that you can put your questions in the Q&A section, any questions that you have for Emily, and we'll get to those in just a little bit.
All roads lead back to the pandemic.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. That's kind of what I want to talk to you about.
Yeah, that's fine. Absolutely.
Ask every question about that.
But like, what else are we going to talk about this year? It's fine. I'm happy to talk about it.
Like you already mentioned that you were called the disaster artist, but what does it feel like to have a pandemic kind of come after this book that was already highly successful? And what does it feel like in a pandemic to be promoting a book and having to keep talking about it?
I'm going to answer that, but we have a special guest.
No, we're going to have a guest first.
Yeah. It's my daughter, Cassie. I want to say hi to Isaac.
Hi.
Hi, Cassie. Your hair is so beautiful. It's so long. Yeah. I saw you about a year ago.
Oh, that's right.
When your mom...
You crashed my first Zoom event a year ago. I'm going to come upstairs in about a half hour. Yeah. I can't talk right now. I'm so sorry. I'll be right back.
No, do a secret. Do a secret. Oh, good microphone covering too. I was excited. I thought we were going to get to hear the secret.
I put them in a safe place. It's okay. I'll see you later. Could you please close my office door? Bye. All right. That's okay. I'll get it. All right.
I am dead from cuteness.
Right? Yeah, like I'm biased, but come on.
Absolutely incredible. Also, she's grown so much.
No, I know. Yeah, I'd forgotten she crashed our first event.
Are you allowed to share the secrets?
The Valentine she made seems to be missing. I'm going to find it. I feel confident that it hasn't been thrown out. I think I just put it on top of some books.
There's a Valentine's thief in the house.
Yeah. Yeah.
But yeah, basically,
right. So writing Station 11.
My question down, which is funny because I feel like we could ask it of anyone. including the author of Station 11, is how sick are you of talking about pandemics?
I'm fine with it. It was really uncomfortable at first because, when the pandemic was first a thing, like obviously there were a ton of questions about Station 11. And I had a ton of invitations to write op-eds about pandemics and, being the author of Station 11 in a pandemic. And at first, I really resisted all of that because I didn't want to give the impression that I was like using this pandemic to move units, to be crass about it. But it felt a little creepy to me. So at first I was like, I don't want to talk about pandemics, but that was all anyone wanted to talk about. And it's fine. I'm totally used to it. It is a little bit strange to have written Station 11 in a pandemic, but something that became really clear in my research for Station 11 is that there was always going to be another pandemic. That's just the way it goes. It's before this, it was Ebola. After COVID-19, it will be something else and something else after that. And that is the history of humanity. It's a line of pandemics all down the centuries. So I wouldn't say that prepared me in any kind of practical way. It's one thing to know there will always be another pandemic and another thing to figure out where to buy N95 masks. But yeah, so I did have that awareness. I don't think that really helped that much somehow with the shock of it when it came. When we talked to each other a year ago, we were both sort of reeling like, wait, what? Seriously, a pandemic? I will say there was one guy having a much stranger experience than me. Patrick Somerville is also a novelist, and he's the showrunner on the Station 11 TV series, which is filming in Toronto. He's also the head writer. So in the early days of the pandemic, there was a guy in Los Angeles writing the season finale for Station 11, which I feel like is objectively weirder than being the person who wrote the book 6 years ago. So yeah.
It's like meta on meta. I also love the phrase, basically, pandemics all the way down. That's just humanity.
Yeah.
Can I ask you a little bit about that project?
Definitely. Can we just talk about how meta it is? Because this is crazy. So they filmed, so Station 11, the pre-apocalyptic sections, a lot of them were set in Toronto, where I went to school. I love that city. The showrunner is from Chicago. So he was like, if you don't mind, I'm more comfortable with Chicago. I want to move the action to there. I have dual citizenship. So I was like, sure, So he moved it to Chicago. They filmed 2 episodes in January of last year. And then the Station 11 production was interrupted by a real pandemic. So they all kind of went their separate ways doing post-production and like writing new episodes and Zooming. And, of course, the epidemiological situation in Canada is much better than here. So they've moved the filming to Canada, but Canada will be playing the United States. It's like Toronto will be playing the role of Chicago. So it just goes like round and round. It's
Toronto.
Yeah. Isn't that crazy? It's so like
this feels like the intricacies of one of your novels. This feels like
exactly. Except if I wrote it, my editors would be like, "This is kind of complicated and hard to follow. Can you just like cut out a couple of layers?"
We're quite at the duck yet. So is filming back on now? Is it back on track? It's posing as the U.S.
Yeah, it's back on track. I think they're all gathered just south of Toronto, and it's happening. I wish. I mean, I was about to say I wish there wasn't a pandemic. Don't we all? I would have visited the set if there weren't a pandemic. That would have been cool.
Yeah, of course. And that's another thing. Like, of course, when you're having one of these big things, and this is something you've touched on eloquently in your writing, is this: there are the big losses, and then there are these like little losses, and just like that, you absolutely written for all these years. Like, what a dream to be able to go to this world that you created.
Oh yeah. I was looking forward to seeing the post-apocalyptic airport, and I think that would have been cool. Yeah.
Absolutely would have been cool. Do you have, what's the word I'm looking for? The beautiful thing about Station 11 is how hopeful it is, in a way. And to be honest, the Glass Hotel, a bit darker in ways. But
yeah, I think so.
Is there, not to borderline Hallmark card this and get a little cheap, but are there some like optimistic, is there some light that you kind of hold on to get through what we're going through right now?
Yeah, there is. This will end, is my feeling. I have high hopes for 2022. Not to be too bleak, but I'm trying to be realistic about the speed of vaccination versus the variants. I don't think life will be normal for a while. So I think about it in terms of an ending. Day to day, there are real bright spots. I feel like my kid's doing okay, and that's by no means a given. Like that's something I'm so grateful for. And I have been able to work, which is amazing. A lot of people haven't. So, I do feel a lot of gratitude, and there are absolutely bright spots. The little like 3-family pod that I'm in, that does feel like a little community, and we're between each other's houses in a way that I really wasn't with anybody like before all this happened. So yeah, I long for the lost paradise of 2019, but it's not all bleak.
Have you guys taken to doing some Shakespeare plays?
We should. Yeah, we should really get out on the road.
All right, I'm going to turn now to some of these wonderful questions from the audience. Again, if you are watching and you have a question for Emily, you can just drop it in the Q&A, not the chat room. Thank you so much. Going to start here with Martin Wilson right off the top. And this was a fantastic thing that I'd forgotten to bring up during our conversation right now, so I'm glad you asked this, Martin. I love how the novel connects to Station 11. I love how the novel The Glass Hotel connects to Station 11 in a fascinating way, this idea of alternate worlds. And just for the record, this isn't too much of a spoiler, but it feels like there's some light touching. Is this something that will continue in your future novels? And just for my own curiosity, Emily, why did you decide to do that?
I'll answer the second part first. I just fell in love with a couple of characters from Station 11. I usually don't have an attachment to a novel once I finished it. If anything, like The Glass Hotel took 5 years, which is like, get this thing off my desk. But I felt very ready to move on. But I do become really attached to particular characters. And in Station 11, there was Miranda Carroll, who we mostly saw as the wife of this actor, but who had this other kind of almost just barely alluded to career as a shipping executive. And it was interesting to bring her back for The Glass Hotel, but focus on her working life, which is her joy and her passion, and really like barely allude to her past, if at all. And then I really liked her boss, Leon, who was only mentioned, I think, a couple of times in Station 11, but is, of course, a major character in The Glass Hotel. So, I was attached to these characters. I knew I wanted to use them again. That's a pretty formidable logistical problem when you've killed them off in a flu pandemic. So, right, enter alternate universes. So toward the end of Station 11, I realized that I was going to want to use some of these characters again. So I put in this little riff where there are these 2 characters in one of the post-apocalyptic chapters. They're sitting there and they're playing this game that they've clearly been playing since childhood, where they're just kind of riffing on alternate universes. Imagine a world where the flu didn't happen, for example. And then I was trying to lay the groundwork there for this idea of divergent realities. And then in The Glass Hotel,
you knew you were doing that at that point.
Yeah, I knew I was doing it at that point. I was laying the groundwork. And then early on in The Glass Hotel, Vincent's wandering the streets of Manhattan, and she's kind of playing the same game, just kind of riffing with herself on alternate versions of reality. For example, a world where that terrifying flu hadn't been quite so swiftly contained and where civilization had collapsed. So I was trying to establish that we were in 2 parallel universes. I know I wasn't entirely successful because there have been a couple of reviews of The Glass Hotel that have been like, clearly this book is set in the years immediately before the Station 11 pandemic. And I'm like, no, the pandemic's not coming. but yeah, that was my intent. And it was just to use those characters again.
I will say, when I read it, I feel like I got what you were going for.
Good, thank you.
I'm going to ask Leah Kaiser here is saying, Emily, I've noticed that a lot of your books, and this is a great point as well, have a moment where a line is drawn through. A character's life and their life is split almost into a before and an after. What about moments like that interest you? And why do you choose to write about them? Great question.
That is a great question. I don't know why those moments interest me, to be honest. Like, I don't have any kind of personal anecdote that would explain it. I am interested in those moments, though, like the moment when it's like somehow too late and everything is irrevocably altered.
I mean, there's one of those moments very early in the book, like sorry.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, it is something I think about. As I say that, I find myself thinking about my grandmother who died of Alzheimer's. And this is a really long time ago. But what I remember thinking about during that period is like the last moment of a memory. And, presumably we all go through that day to day, not in that kind of extreme illness triggered way, but there's a moment when you remember something. And there's a moment when you have absolutely forgotten that phone number or that teacher's name or whatever it was. And like, that is a moment in the middle. I feel like I'm not articulating this very well, but
Yeah.
I am really fascinated by that idea of just like, where's the exact point? Like, where's that dividing line after which it's too late and you're in a different story?
And there's no going back.
Yeah, exactly.
And again, I think that's actually very much tied in with your interest in regret and, dare I say it, almost fragility
Right.
of the ways in which these choices, because that the Glass Hotel for me is, there's so many different lines kind of being drawn all over the place. And like I said, the way that you interconnect everything so beautifully with such beautiful language is so impressive. And I do think it speaks to that. The stories that we lead, obviously, they're, to think of multiple universes, there's all these different ways to live them, but the ones that
Right.
we have are actually very, very fragile and
Yeah.
can be dispersed with a decision. I love this one from, I'm so sorry if I'm mispronouncing the name, Abe Wiesenthal, or Abe Wiesenthal. Very flattering comments. After reading Station 11, I remember thinking that I could not wait to read another book by Emily St. John Mandel.
Thank
Is
you.
there an author like that for you, Emily?
Yeah, I will read anything by Jennifer Egan, Dan Shawn, or David Mitchell. They're just like automatic go-tos. Also, Zadie Smith. I love her work.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, maybe we all have a few of those. The sort of like, I'll buy anything you write authors.
No,
Yeah.
and it's wonderful. I mean, David Mitchell, also like being so beautiful in world building. I feel like that's like the bone clock. Like anything I pick up, I'm just like, I just can't wait to dive into this because I just know it's going to be an explosion.
Yeah, exactly. And it'll be somehow like part of the same universe. And that's such a pleasure as a reader. Maybe we're all just striving and longing for some kind of order in the universe. But yeah, I love the way his books connect.
Yeah, the way that they have that touching. It's fine just to think of another, like Stephen King does that so much, and to such a degree that it's a wonderful way to get lost in a universe of books, basically. In Station 11, I'm sorry, this is an anonymous attendee. A comic book is a central touchstone. Do you read comics and graphic novels? And is that a medium you have any interest in writing?
I don't read that many, but I have maybe. I always think in terms of like linear bookshelf feet. I have like 18 inches of graphic novels, which is not a lot in the context of, compared to the fiction section. That's pretty small. Yeah, I would say it's a medium I'm interested in, but haven't read a ton of. So I definitely want to read a lot more before I ever attempted it. I think it's a beautiful medium. And it's funny. I'm not a huge fan of memoir. Just I have nothing against it. It just doesn't grab my attention the way, say, fiction does. But graphic novel memoirs are amazing. I'm really into those. I love Alison Bechdel's work. And there's this really moving memoir I picked up a few years ago called Blankets by Craig Thompson. It's really kind of gentle, beautiful, graphic coming of age story. So yeah, it's a form I'm drawn to, but I don't feel like I've read enough of it to try it. Also, like I can't draw, so I'd have to connect with an artist.
That's fascinating to me. Just a follow-up question. What do you think it is about a memoir graphic novel that captures your imagination? Because it's a medium that I absolutely love too. To be fair, I also just love memoirs.
Right.
What do you think it is about the illustration that makes it more accessible for you?
I don't know. I mean, does it somehow touch? I wonder if it's neurological. Like, does it touch a different part of your brain when you're seeing the image? Does it make it easier to make the leap into somebody else's life? Is it just the beauty of it, like seeing the way an artist has rendered it? I'm not sure. I'll have to think about it. Or maybe it's just the way it kind of changes the writing into this sort of like staccato by default style. You're not rambling on and on and on in a graphic novel. It's fitting in panels. Maybe that's partly it. But
You like that?
I don't know what it is, but it just speaks to
like
him.
that it keeps it moving.
It keeps it moving.
You're like, you can't just go on for 20 pages about
Exactly. Yeah. Talk about your dad for half a page and then move on.
Finding that duck. You're finding that duck. Rachel Rifkin had a question here that kind of dovetails very nicely with what we're talking about here. Would you ever have plans to work with an illustrator to create a graphic novel of Station 11 to bring that to life?
In theory, I would love to. In practice, I've been like juggling a ton of projects to keep myself busy during the pandemic. So that's my personal sanity strategy. Yeah, but it's one of those things. I feel like I've been saying for 6 years that I would love to collaborate with an illustrator, but I've never made the first step to make that happen. So it feels a little bit like an abstract desire. But it would be beautiful. I've spent a lot of time imagining what the Dr. 11 comic books could look like.
Yeah, it's good to listen to yourself though too. You're like, there's a lot of other things that I've said yes to. I haven't
Exactly. Yeah.
This aspect of it yet. Speaking of other ways in which the story is going to be told, though, you were talking about the television show. We've got a question here about, do you have any idea when it might come out? Is there a wrap date, anything like that you can share with us? No sweat, of course. If not, that's from Charlie Jordan.
Oh, for Station 11 or the Glass Hotel?
Station 11.
Station 11. Yeah, I don't know very much more than anybody else does because I have no official involvement with the production. But I just did a Zoom event about a week ago with Patrick Somerville, the showrunner who I mentioned before. It was really fun, and he was talking about that. If I remember correctly, I think he said that they expected to wrap filming in late 2021. And it would probably start airing not too long after that. So he seemed to feel like early 2022 was plausible. We're close, right? It's not that far out.
A lot of hopes on 2022.
I know. No pressure, 2022.
But now I got to ask a follow-up question, just as a good interviewer. You did say the Glass Hotel. Is there movement with the Glass Hotel as well?
Yeah, it's at a much earlier stage. That's actually been really exciting for me. I've really enjoyed it. I love writing novels, but at this point I've written 6 novels, and it was really fun to have the opportunity to write something completely different. So I said yes to being involved in the Glass Hotel project, and it has been such a joy. It's so different from writing a book. It's so collaborative. I work really well with my co-writer, who would be the eventual showrunner if the show gets bought, Semi Chellis. Yeah, I've just enjoyed it so much. It's a completely different form. And yeah, that's much earlier. We have a pilot script. We've got an outline. We're going to try to sell it in the next few weeks.
Well, you said you're going first off, fingers crossed. Congrats.
Thank you.
Good luck. How does just my own personal follow-up here, like, how do you approach the storytelling in writing a script differently? Like, you just said outline. So like,
no, I just use the O word. Yeah, it's pretty much the opposite of my process with writing a novel, which is maybe why it's so fun. It forces me to use a completely different part of my brain, I guess. Yeah, with television, you kind of can't wing it. Like you've got to know where the series is going. So being forced by the nature of the process to write an outline has actually been a really interesting exercise for me. I've never worked that way before. And it's really fun. I don't think that I would ever write an outline for a novel, but it's fun to just learn how to do it for TV. The mechanics of emotional peaks and lows, and the tension needs to increase here and decrease there, and how do you develop characters throughout. It's a very detailed outline, and it was fun to put together.
Like you said, there's a joy in the collaboration aspect of it. But for writing it, is it just so much more focused on dialogue, and like, do you feel like you're accessing that same part of your brain that when you're writing fiction, writing a novel, or is there kind of a different process, not just outline,
right?
It's like your approach to it.
Yeah, it does feel different. It's my first time writing for the screen, and I hadn't previously realized how different the requirements of the different forms are. With television, every scene has to have such incredibly heightened tension. There's got to be a fight, or a character has to change. It's so heightened compared to a novel where, obviously in a novel, you don't want to go on and on in any kind of boring, extraneous way. But not every scene needs to be like cliff top, high stakes, So yeah, it's been an interesting process that way. And also kind of an interesting education, just in, all of us have had the experience where a book you love is adapted to film or TV. And you watch it and you're like, ugh, I love the original. It was nothing like the original. Yeah, because it had to be different because, just like completely different dramatic requirements of the form. So it's been really interesting to realize that.
And is it safe to say that The Glass Hotel will be different in these ways? Like there will be. I mean, because the novel itself jumps around a timeline. So I would argue it probably serves that pretty well. You can kind of move those pieces around.
Yeah, it's the same basic pieces with 50% more plot is really the way I describe it. There's just a lot more happens within that framework.
I've got a couple last questions here for you.
Sure.
And I really love this one because it's basically Robin Wetherill asking the same thing that I asked about finance, but about shipping. Okay. I never thought about shipping as an evocative idea until I read
You're welcome. Yeah.
Now it seems fascinating. And again, it's a wonder that you do it. I felt in some ways it mirrored the ways characters drifted by each other in The Glass Hotel. Can you say more about what got you interested in shipping?
Sure. I love questions for which I have a very specific answer. An article that ran in 2009, I think it was in the Daily Mail. The writer's name was Simon Perry. And the article, remember, this is like the height of the economic collapse, the last economic collapse. And the title of the article was something like Revealed, the ghost fleet of the recession. And it described this really kind of surreal situation where when there's an economic collapse, there's just less demand for goods because nobody's buying stuff, which means less stuff needs to be shipped across oceans, which means all the shipping companies suddenly have a huge overcapacity problem. And it's not like there's a parking lot for ships. The system's designed to remain in constant motion. So the world's shipping companies had all of these ships that they had absolutely no use for. They just didn't need the space. So the solution they came up with, which was kind of weird, was a fleet of them from various companies was just kind of anchored about 100 miles south of Singapore Harbor. So what that looked like in practical terms was the residents of this small fishing village looked out one night and the horizon was ablaze with lights. It was like a ghost city on the horizon. And I just found that haunting as an image and really beautiful. And I guess that spurred my interest. A short time later, I shouldn't say a short time later, it would have been a couple of years later, I was on tour and I came across this book called 90% of Everything by Rose George, a British journalist. And the title kind of gives away the plot, which, it's about shipping. 90% of everything. Almost everything on and around us came to us over the ocean. Mm-hmm. And we don't think about that because we don't have to. It's something we can safely take for granted. But it is kind of fascinating to me to think about that combination of scale and invisibility where, the shipping industry, it drives our global economy. But we don't really see it. It's completely out of sight. So yeah, I think it's those combination of things that drew me to it. I don't know if I'd write a third book that focused on the shipping industry, but I've found it very interesting for a couple of books now.
That's it. I mean, in a way, it's we are haunted by these things that are like deliberate.
Yeah, like yeah, exactly.
It very much ties into everything that we're talking about. All right, the last question here, and just for the record, if we didn't get to your question, I apologize. They were all so very, very wonderful. Thank you for sharing. But the last question I'm going to go with here is from Carissa Longo. In Station 11, but also to an extent in The Glass Hotel, characters turn to various art forms in the face of their disasters. What kind of art has been getting you through the current pandemic? What kind of art do you think will emerge as a reaction to COVID?
That's interesting. Books have been getting me through, which, it's a little cliched for a writer, but, that's been a real bright spot for me, I have to say, not just in my own life reading, but the way all the Brookline bookstores are swamped. They have these notes on their website. It's going to take us a couple of days to fulfill your pickup orders. And I see that. I'm like, good for you. Like, that's amazing. I love to see that. So it's wonderful that so many people are reading books, and that bookstores have been able to pivot in the way they have, Brookline and Green Light, where we did our first event together, and, so many others. It's so impressive, and it speaks to a need that people have for art in these moments.
Absolutely. And with that being said, I encourage you to buy The Glass Hotel if you haven't already from Brookline, and also any other books that you need to support them. Alex just came back. I'm just going to do the thing that I do. I'm just going to clap real quick. Emily, thank you so
Emily.
much.
Thank you.
Thank you both so much for being here tonight. This is a fantastic conversation to be able to sit in and listen to. Yeah, again, if anyone is here who hasn't read Glass Hotel yet, you're in for a wonderful, wonderful treat. Thank you to everyone for attending, and have a great night, everyone.
I hope
Thank you all
find
so much.
Valentine's Day.
Thank you. All right. Thanks, Isaac. Thank you, Alex. Good to see you both.
Bye.